Welcome back to the Mental Health Toolbox podcast. I am Patrick Martin, your host. Here I'll be discussing ways to improve your mood, be more efficient, and improve your quality of life. In last episode, we started talking about the 12 basic coping skills for depression through the lens of CBT. That stands for Cognitive Behavioral Therapy. If you're joining us for the first time, do be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of the new content that we put out. Okay? In this episode, we'll be discussing skill number 2 of 12 and how to manage our mood using CBT skills. So let's do it.
Welcome to the Mental Health Toolbox podcast, where you will gain the knowledge to thrive. Here is your host, licensed psychotherapist, Patrick Martin.
Okay, so skill number 2, how to identify your unhealthy thought patterns. In this episode, I'll be covering how to identify our unhealthy thought patterns. We'll also be covering the chaining skill, which is a CBT-based skill where we look at events that have happened in retrospect, kind of break those down into a series of events and look at the sequence and see if we can find any points of interventions for future implications, okay? And by doing this, we find ways to improve our mood as we learn to cope better and to manage problems as they come versus avoidance. The ABCs of CBT, those are the basic automatic or activating events, the behaviors that follow, and then, of course, looking at the consequences, okay? So that's the basic premise of CBT. We'll be covering that. We will also be looking at how do we categorize our thoughts. So meaning when we think about our thinking, like we discussed in last episode, it's not always easy to examine our thoughts. Thoughts are automatic. They just happen. They come, they go. But it's really important that we learn to start labeling our disturbing or intrusive, disruptive, negative thoughts so that we know what to look for as we start to challenge them, okay? As mentioned in the previous episode when we were covering the first skill, I mentioned that it's important to acknowledge the fact that we're not brought up in a society where we're socialized into thinking about our thinking. Learning to examine our thoughts and their relevance is something we must condition ourselves to do. Let's move on to learning how to identify our unhealthy thought patterns. I'll cover some of the most common unhealthy thinking patterns and how to examine, challenge, and replace them with more relevant, accurate thoughts true to their context, versus those that are pulled out of a reference of past lived experience, such as a traumatic event. In the previous episode, I touched on the importance of tracking your mood. This is as important for linking associated thoughts as in identifying your triggers, and I would even argue more important. In its most basic form, an unhealthy thought is pessimistic, limiting, judging, or shaming, or all of the above. The fascinating thing, however, is that we all tend to have repetitious patterns in our negative thoughts. This is a good thing, actually, because it means that if we are able to start labeling our thoughts, then it becomes easier to catch them. Enter the chaining skill for increasing healthy thoughts and lifting your mood. Chaining is a term that will become common knowledge if you continue to listen to the following episodes. It is a skill that allows you to see the progression of your thoughts and the correlating mood in an upward or downward trend. In cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT for short, a traditional mood scale is used and ranges from 1 to 9, with 9 being the happiest and 1 being the most depressed. If we imagine that 5 is a neutral event and we assign it to a triggering event, then we start to see the relationship between our thoughts and our mood pretty quickly. Now, a note on triggers. Triggering events are only triggering because of the connotations or the meanings that we ascribe to them. That is not to say that they're inconsequential, but rather that it is important that we attend to the way in which we respond to these events, starting with our interpretations of them, and thus our self-talk. For example, if we say that the event taking place is a job loss, we would label it as a 5 on a scale of 1 to 9. Second, we would imagine what a typical thought would be for us. We're all a little bit different, but just for simplicity's sake. and decide that if that thought would bring our mood up or down. Is that thought helpful or unhelpful? For example, a number 4 would be something like, no one values me, or what is wrong with me? That might lead to a more distressing thought, such as, I cannot keep a job. Or something more distressing after that, like, what is the point of looking for work? Nothing ever works out for me. And then a 1 might sound something like, I am useless, no one values me without a job, no one wants to help me, so why bother asking for help at all? Now, if we followed the upward trend from a 5, we would start with a 6, which might sound something like this. It is unfortunate, but I need to start looking for another job. Feel the difference? That might lead to a more helpful thought, such as, I learned a lot from my last job that I can apply to my next job, right? So we're carrying over our skills. An 8 would probably sound something like, I will update my resume. So now we're getting into more proactive, intentional action. A number 9 would sound something like, I will call a temp agency if I cannot find a job on my own within 2 weeks. And you can see how the thought pattern line starts to create this mental model of what that behavior actually looks like in real time. Okay? And so that is how our thoughts tend to work. We don't start with a 9 and we don't usually start with a 1. It's usually a pattern that gets put into place and snowballs in one direction or the other. Now, understanding the progression of our thoughts is important because it emphasizes the process in catching our initial reactions to events early on. The chaining exercise and the example we just went through illustrates the relationship between the nature of our thoughts, our sense of competence, and our corresponding level of motivation. This brings us to the ABCs of CBT. The problem with our thoughts is that they are often non-factual, and yet we take them at face value. Remember that a thought is often a statement or a question. Now, this will be really important as we move on, as we'll discuss, because the more that we can frame our thoughts as questions, the more likely they'll be accurate, balanced, and complete, which is what we want. Questions beget questions. In order to test our thoughts for validity, we need to screen them with 3 criteria that I just mentioned: accuracy, balance, and completeness. If we are careful to check our thoughts this way, then our interpretations and assessments of events and our reflections of our own actions are going to be better rooted in reality and thus more fair to others and to ourselves. This in turn yields a better acceptance of the circumstances and better confidence in how we choose to proceed in response to the event. So the ABCs then are about checking our thoughts. However, before we can check them, first we must learn how to catch them, which brings us to the next skill: labeling. Labeling, or categorizing your thoughts. When we start to pay attention to our thought process, we are already ahead of most other people in terms of personal growth. That is because when we are being mindful of our intentions, we gain a greater perspective and understanding of the many cofactors involved in the circumstance we find ourselves observing. In the words of Aristotle, we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit. Think about that for a minute. Excellence isn't a habit, it's intentionally the repetition of our behavior. And so if we want to improve our quality of life, if we want to improve the way we think about things, the way we respond to things, how we interact with others, we have to spend time observing, reflecting on those events, our behaviors, and especially our thoughts and interpretations around those events in order to improve not just our outlook, but our core beliefs around those events, which will manifest in our behavior. So when it comes to labeling our thoughts, it helps to think of these thoughts as common habits of unhealthy thinking. These are the things that we want to learn to label so we can catch them faster and then correct them. And the faster we catch them, the more we can mitigate the fallout of the skewed assumptions derived from them. As you learn to observe your thoughts and label them, you will likely find that you will gravitate toward distinct categories, and it is not uncommon for any one of us to have a particular pitfall we learn to guard against as we grow, meaning that we tend to have the same distressing thoughts that pop up over and over again, but unless we're really watching, we may not even realize they're repeating. The good news means that we don't have to look for 10, 20 different types of thought patterns. Really, once we figure out what our pitfall is, it's easy to catch it. And once we learn to challenge those thoughts, we're ahead of the game because then we can see them coming. If you keep at it, you can learn to identify your unhealthy thought patterns faster and disrupt the negative behavior patterns that follow. The following categories are the most common harmful thought patterns. There are 11 general categories, but you can expound, and of course, you can label them whatever you want. They're your thoughts, right? So the first is catastrophizing. Yes, that's actually a word in the mental health world. This is a telltale sign of anxiety. You know you are catastrophizing when you are fast-forwarding 100 steps ahead to the worst possible outcomes, as if they were the most likely to happen, which prevents you from dealing with things as they come and maintaining perspective and proceeding mindfully, being able to consider all your options. So basically, catastrophizing robs you of the ability to be present and problem solve. So not cool. The next one is all or nothing thinking, which is often referred to as black and white thinking. There is no gray area. Things and relationships and people are labeled as either all good or all bad. Statements of the self are very concrete, such as I am unlovable or I can't talk about my feelings. The next one is negative fortune telling. This is similar to pessimism, but differs in that it is tantamount to the handicapped sense of pleasure predicting. With this thought process, it becomes very difficult to sustain any sense of motivation because everything seems pointless. This is oftentimes what accompanies anhedonia, a common symptom of depression, wherein the person loses interest in activities they used to enjoy. Because why go to that party you scheduled? Because it's not going to be any fun anyway, right? Even though you spent a week planning it. That kind of thing. Then there's pessimism. This is like assuming that the deck is stacked against you all the time, or that the dice of life are loaded. Practically, things are usually at least 50-50 in terms of their outcome, right? I mean, if we're being fair. This is like seeing life through a 25-75 lens, 75 being the bad. Then there's labeling oneself, and it's just like it sounds. We label ourselves with derogatory absolutes, like stupid, ugly, bad. Which, of course, once you go down that road, it's no good. Then there's negative filtering. This one's a little tricky. And this is the thing that prevents people from giving us compliments or stop praising you. And it's really dangerous with depression. This is the act of minimizing positive feedback, but exaggerating any feedback that could be perceived as negative or critical. This often looks like being overly modest, right? Which you think might be a virtue, but it's not. This is especially dangerous because it creates social boundaries, unspoken boundaries oftentimes, that others will respect by discontinuing to provide you with praise, which feeds back into depressive self-talk. See? No one ever says anything nice to me. And it really promotes those types of thoughts. Because people are doing what you've taught them to do, to leave you alone, to avoid you, to not praise you. And so then all you're left with is what you're focusing on in the first place, which is the negative feedback from your environment. Now there's exaggerating. This is that old saying of making mountains out of molehills. We either become paralyzed from addressing our problems because they seem bigger than life, or turn minor grievances into social warfare. So this is no good for relationships, to be sure. And then there's overgeneralization. This is the act of projecting an infinite number of negative outcomes from a single event, often reflecting a lack of belief in one's own capabilities. It is making the assumption that all solutions will occur in like manner, and therefore discourage one from attempting something a second time if their initial experience was poor, right? So it's making that assumption that all experiences are going to be like this horrible experience I had, and then you extrapolate that into all of your future assumptions. And so that causes avoidance. And so your friend calls you to go to a party, and you're like, no, I've got to babysit my cat, or something like that. You make up some excuse to avoid. And that makes you feel safe because you don't want to relive it. Who wants to, right? The next one is shoulding. This is the act of feeling obligated to do something, or self-imposed guilt for not acting according to your own expectations, leaving yourself feeling resentful, oppositional, or at the very least disappointed. So it's setting the bar so high for yourself that you end up shaming yourself, feeling bad, guilting yourself because you didn't meet your own standard, which really wasn't reasonable to begin with. And also taking all the credit. You assume that if something fails, it's entirely your fault, as opposed to looking at everything as shared responsibility. Next, we have blaming oneself. And it's just like it sounds. The belief pattern that all unfortunate outcomes stem from your own actions. You are always at fault, regardless of the circumstances. And lastly, we have mind reading. Very common with anxiety, but also with people pleasers and low self-esteem. Mind reading is assuming you know what others are thinking in relation to you, and it is a negative appraisal. This is also referred to as reflected appraisals in psychology, meaning that we anticipate what other people are thinking, and then that allows us to paint a picture of our own value based on other people's appraisals. So rather than starting with our own value, self-image as a baseline, we look to other people to tell us what our baseline is. This is the thing I used to struggle with probably the most, and still do from time to time. And like I said, we all have our own thought patterns or pitfalls that we've struggled with. And mine was, and to some extent still is, mind reading. But I've become very, very good for the most part at catching it before it causes any damage. All right, so those are the 11 categories of unhealthy thoughts and thought patterns, and we could definitely deep dive into any one, but that'll give you some reference when you're tracking your mood to see which ones kind of creep up on you. Okay, so now application time. So how do we put what we just discussed into practice? In order to learn how to identify your unhealthy thought patterns, you will need to practice the skills we just discussed in this episode until it becomes a habit, kind of like Aristotle said, right? Excellence is formed from habit, repetitious behavior, focused intentional behavior toward a specific goal, right? And so this is the exercise. At the end of every day, I want you to rate your mood kind of, on average. I'm not looking for decimals or fractions or, ranges. Keep it simple, right? This is where most people mess up with mood tracking. They think it's like a journaling thing. It's not. It's quick and dirty. Before your head hits the pillow at night, I want you to reflect on the day and say, how was my mood today? Was it a 9, really good, or was it a 1, really bad? Chances are it was somewhere in between, right? Because we're looking for an average. Then I want you to list any specific events that occurred that day that may have contributed to your mood, for the better or for the worse. For example, went to lunch with a coworker, probably positive. Got in a fight with my spouse, probably not so positive. And that will affect your mood. But more importantly, it's going to elicit certain thoughts. So try to recall what category of thought you notice the most in conjunction with your moods, particularly your low moods. This is going to be a telltale sign of what your thought patterns are when you start looking at just the days with the low moods. At the end of a week or two, look for a trend of thought patterns that you can identify. For example, if you see that you have 3s every Saturday, ding, 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 something's going on Saturdays, right? Could be the environment, could be the person you're around, but something is triggering your negative thoughts. That will be your target for catching your thoughts. You will become armed with a way to label your thoughts and then challenge them for accuracy, balance, and completeness. All right? Sounds simple enough. If it sounds complicated at all, if you go to the mentalhealthtoolbox.com, that's my blog site, I do have a free download for the mood tracking tool with all the instructions I just went through, and you can also get the show notes there. I'll put it in the description, okay? And of course, do not forget to subscribe to this podcast so that you don't miss out on any content that I put out in the future, okay? Because we're only on skill number 2. There's 12, and that's just to do with basic CBT skills and dealing with anxiety and depression, okay? So there's a lot more to come. Stick with us. And there you have it, another tool for your toolbox so you can do more than cope, but thrive. If you happen to be in crisis, you know anyone who's in crisis, there are a lot of hotlines out there. There's a lot of help. A great line you can call is the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-8255, or you can text START, S-T-A-R-T, to 741-741. If you're just looking for mental health referrals or resources for family, NAMI, the National Association of Mental Illness, has a referral line you can call and get in touch with someone who can point you in the right direction. That number is 1-800-950-6264. In the next episode, I'll be covering fact-finding, reality testing, thought replacement, and the CBT catch it, check it, change it mantra. So don't miss it. Be sure to check out the next episode. And until then, Team Thrivers, you take care, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye now.
Thanks for listening to the Mental Health Toolbox Podcast. Learn more at www.thementalhealthtoolbox.com.